Ask most people what Arab DNA looks like, and you'll get the same answer: one bloodline, spread by empire across 22 nations. Geneticists just tested that directly. The results split clean into four separate ancestral clusters, not four flavors of one group. Four populations old enough to predate the word Arab itself, each carrying its own distinct genetic signature underneath the same shared language and faith. A Moroccan and a Yemeni share a religion, a language, and a history of empire that goes back 14 centuries. They do not descend from one single ancestral population, and the data set behind that finding is one of the largest ever assembled on this specific question. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will know exactly which of those four populations your own family history most likely traces back to. And it is probably not the one you assumed. For 14 centuries, that single story held: one language, Arabic; one faith, Islam, for the vast majority of the region; one shared identity, stretching from the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula all the way to the shores of the Atlantic; 357 million people, spread across 22 nations, treated by historians, by governments, and often by the people themselves as one continuous genetic family, scattered by empire, but united by blood. It made sense on the surface, because the history is one continuous story. When the armies of the early Islamic conquests moved out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, they carried language and faith across 3 continents in a matter of decades. From the sands of Iraq to the mountains of Morocco, from the Nile Valley to the Iberian coast. Whole regions adopted a new tongue and a new faith within a few generations, and that language and faith held, essentially unbroken, for the next 1400 years. A form filled out in Cairo and a form filled out in Casablanca still check the same box today. But almost nobody asked the obvious next question until very recently: did the genes travel the same way the language did? Because language and religion can spread across a continent without replacing a single person who was already living on that land before the conquest arrived. Egypt existed as an organized civilization for 3,000 years before a single Arab army ever crossed its border. The Berber populations of North Africa carried their own genetic lineage, stretching back tens of thousands of years before Arabic was ever spoken on that land. Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, was the birthplace of civilization itself, home to Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians long before the word Arab existed in any historical record at all. So when geneticists finally set out to directly test whether Arab populations across the region share one unified genetic ancestry, they weren't just running a routine population study. They were reopening a question that touches identity, history, and politics all at once, a question people had simply assumed the answer to for 14 centuries. And the answer they found turned out to be more complicated and more consequential than almost anyone expected going in. It is worth pausing on why this question sat unasked for so long. Large-scale population genetics is a young science generally, and building a dataset this size across multiple countries takes real coordination, funding, and time, the kind of undertaking that tends to happen later for any region, not just this one. That gap is exactly what the next 2 discoveries in this video finally closed. The first real answer came from one of the largest genetic anthropology studies ever conducted specifically on the Arab world. Researchers pulled together data from more than 100 population samples, spanning 36 distinct Arab and neighboring communities, involving more than 16,000 individuals in total. It remains to this day one of the most extensive genetic surveys of the Middle East and North Africa ever assembled in a single dataset. The scientists were not looking at surface-level traits like skin tone, height, or facial features, the kind of thing a stranger might guess at from across a room. They were examining a set of genetic markers called HLA genes, the human leukocyte antigen system, widely considered some of the most information-dense markers in the entire human genome. These genes control how the immune system recognizes threats, and because they mutate and recombine in extremely population-specific patterns, generation after generation, they function almost like a fingerprint of deep ancestry, one detailed enough to trace a population back thousands of years before any written record ever existed. Every geneticist studying human populations expects some regional variation going in. Nobody was surprised by that part. What the research team did not expect was what happened when they ran the data through the same basic kind of math a family tree program uses to group closer relatives together and split off more distant ones, just scaled up to entire populations instead of individual people. Population after population went into that model, and the output did not draw one circle around the Arab world the way the conventional assumption predicted it would. It drew four distinct genetic clusters, each carrying a measurably different ancestral signature, sitting underneath a shared language and a shared religious history that had convinced nearly everyone for 14 centuries that they were looking at a single bloodline stretched across a continent. That number, 4, is the thread every other discovery in this video eventually connects back to. To be clear about what this does and does not mean, nobody is saying the shared culture is fake, or that 14 centuries of shared language, faith, and history do not matter. Cultural identity and genetic ancestry are simply two different measurements, answering two different questions, and this study only ever asked one of them. What it found is that the genetic answer and the cultural answer do not overlap the way most people, understandably, assumed they would. It is also worth being precise about what the HLA result technically is: a genetic distance measurement, not a straightforward percentage breakdown, the way a commercial ancestry test presents its results. The four-way split describes how the mathematical relationships between the sampled populations clustered once every variable was accounted for. Later studies, using different genetic markers entirely, would go on to confirm the same underlying four-way structure from a completely different angle, which is exactly what the rest of this video walks through next. The first of those four clusters centers on North Africa: Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. Genetically, this cluster carries deep signatures linked to the ancient Berber populations that inhabited these lands for tens of thousands of years before Arabic ever reached the region in the 7th century. This is the cluster that, geographically, sits furthest from the Arabian Peninsula itself, and the genetic data reflects exactly that distance. This is not a minor historical footnote, and it is not a small population either. North Africa's Berber-descended populations number in the tens of millions across the region today. The Berber presence across North Africa predates the Arab conquests by an enormous margin, going back to populations that were already settled across the Maghreb long before any army arrived from the Arabian Peninsula. And that ancestry did not simply vanish once the population adopted a new language and a new faith in the centuries that followed. It stayed. It is still measurably present today, underneath modern national identities that on any official form or world map read simply as Arab. So when a Moroccan and a Yemeni are both described today as Arab, at the genetic level, they are being described as members of two different, much older ancestral populations, currently wearing the same linguistic and religious label, same language spoken today, same faith practiced today. Two different populations underneath, going back long before either label existed at all. Modern genetic ancestry testing companies now routinely separate out a distinct North African or Maghrebi ancestral component for exactly this reason, because the underlying signal is that strong. That also lines up with something else geneticists have long noted about this cluster specifically. North African populations sit at something of a genetic crossroads, carrying the deep Berber substrate underneath, layered with later contributions from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Levant, and, further north, from repeated contact across the Mediterranean over thousands of years. Long before the 7th century, Phoenician traders, then Roman settlers, then Vandal and Byzantine rule all passed through the same coastline, each leaving a small further trace behind. The Arabic language and Islamic faith arrived on top of all of that, as one more layer on a population history that was already thousands of years deep, and by far the most genetically consequential one for the people living there today, since it is the layer that determined what language a Moroccan speaks at home and what a Moroccan writes on a census form, while the older Berber substrate underneath stayed largely where it already was. That is cluster 1, and it is only the first of the 4 the researchers identified. The second cluster centers on the Arabian Peninsula itself: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Yemen. Of the 4 clusters the researchers identified, this is the one carrying what they describe as the closest genetic affinity of any of the 4 to the population historically associated with the earliest use of the word Arab before it ever became an identity spread across 3 continents. Geographically, it is also the cluster the 7th century conquests physically started from, which makes the genetic result line up neatly with the historical record. This is the population the label was originally coined to describe, long before it ever became an umbrella term for a much wider region. In other words, if there is a genetic anchor point for the word Arab, a place the label is closest to describing accurately in a strict ancestral sense, this cluster is the closest thing to it in the entire dataset. Everywhere else on the map, the identity spread by conquest, by trade routes, and by centuries of intermarriage and migration. Here, on the peninsula itself, it sits closer to where the story started, geographically and genetically both. That distinction matters more than it might first sound, because it means the word Arab was never describing one bloodline stretched evenly across a continent the way the popular version of the story assumes. It was describing an origin population centered on the Arabian Peninsula, plus 3 other much older ancestral populations that adopted its language and its faith over the following 14 centuries, without ever becoming genetically identical to it in the process. The label traveled a lot farther than the bloodline did. It also explains something people from the Gulf region have long noticed anecdotally, long before any of this genetic data existed: a persistent sense, informally, of being genealogically closer to the historical tribal record than populations further from the peninsula. Genetics doesn't settle every cultural or historical debate wrapped up in that feeling, but it does confirm there is a real, measurable signal underneath it, not just a cultural impression with nothing behind it. It also reframes something about the peninsula's own internal history. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Yemen are grouped together as one cluster here, but that does not mean the peninsula itself was ever genetically uniform. Like most large regions with a long tribal and regional history, it likely carries its own internal variation that a 4-cluster study, working at a continental scale, was never designed to resolve. The peninsula cluster is simply the closest anchor point for the word Arab in this particular dataset, not a claim that it was ever one single, undivided population. The remaining 2 clusters sit along the Levant and Mesopotamia, modern Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Palestine. Think of this region the way you'd think of a city built on top of several older cities. Every ancient civilization that ever ruled the Fertile Crescent, Canaanite, Assyrian, Phoenician, Aramean, left its own population behind, and each one is still genetically visible today, layered underneath everything that came after. Separately verified ancient DNA research on this exact region backs up just how old that underlying split is. Genome comparisons pulled directly from ancient burial sites show that populations in the Zagros Mountains, in what is now western Iran, and populations across the Levant had already genetically diverged from one another somewhere between 46,000 and 77,000 years ago, a split confirmed through direct sequencing of ancient remains, including one especially well-preserved Neolithic woman from the Zagros region, dated to roughly 10,000 years old. That is not a difference created by the last 14 centuries of Islamic history layered on top. That is a difference tens of thousands of years older than the Arab identity itself, older than agriculture, older than any writing system on Earth. So the shared identity that unites hundreds of millions of people today under one cultural and linguistic umbrella was never a single bloodline to begin with, and never could have been, given how old these underlying populations already were before the 7th century. It was an alliance of ancient, genetically distinct populations, stitched together by conquest, trade, shared religion, and time, 4 separate threads eventually pulled into what today reads, from the outside, as one single label. This is also the cluster that carries the most layered history of any of the 4, because the Fertile Crescent was never conquered just once. Assyrian empires rose and fell here. Babylonian, then Persian, then Greek, then Roman rule passed through in turn, each leaving behind intermarriage and migration on top of the populations already living there. By the time Arabic and Islam arrived in the 7th century, the Levant and Mesopotamia were already some of the most genetically layered territory on the planet. The 7th century conquest added a language and a faith on top of a population history that was already ancient. That also explains why researchers describe this region as carrying 2 related but distinguishable clusters rather than one. Levant populations and Mesopotamian populations diverged from each other long before either group encountered Arabic, shaped by separate river systems, separate ancient states, and separate waves of the empires listed above, landing with different intensity in different places. Lebanon and Syria sit closer to the Mediterranean layering. Iraq sits closer to the older Mesopotamian substrate itself. 2 clusters, not one, both older than the Arab identity that later sat on top of both. If the HLA study was the first real crack in the one bloodline idea, the second major discovery went even further. It didn't just rewrite ancestry, it exposed a real blind spot in modern medicine, one that affects whether a doctor's genetic test understands your body correctly. For decades, nearly every genetic study conducted anywhere on Earth, every disease risk calculation, every commercial ancestry test has been built on top of a single human reference genome, a baseline sequence that scientists use as the yardstick to compare every other genome against. That reference genome leans overwhelmingly on Northern European ancestry, a known limitation scientists have acknowledged for years. Researchers had long suspected this created a real blind spot for other populations around the world. Nobody had built a data set large enough, drawn specifically from the Arab world, to measure how large that blind spot was. So researchers built a replacement. Think of it as a new, more complete answer key, called a pangenome, built not from one person, the way the old reference was, but by combining detailed genetic readings from real people across 8 different countries. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt, deliberately chosen to span both the Gulf and North Africa. When researchers compared this new Arab pangenome against the standard global reference genome used by labs worldwide, they found that a meaningful share of the genetic variation present in Arab populations, estimated at roughly 6% of the added sequence data, simply was not represented in the standard reference at all. That gap is not a rounding error. It touches genetic variants tied to how bodies process certain medications, how immune systems respond to disease, and how some hereditary conditions get triggered in the first place. Variation that had effectively been invisible to precision medicine for decades, for a population of over 350 million people, simply because the reference model the entire world built its research on was never designed with them in mind from the start. This is not just an abstract statistics problem sitting inside an academic research paper somewhere, unread. Precision medicine increasingly relies on matching a patient's genome against reference data to predict drug response and disease risk. A 6% gap means that, for hundreds of millions of people, some of that matching has been running against an incomplete map the entire time. And the Arab Pangenome project exists specifically to close that gap going forward, part of a broader push in genomics to build reference data for populations the original reference genome left out. If that number surprised you, subscribe. This channel exists to dig up exactly these kinds of gaps, the parts of population genetics that never make it into a textbook. And if you've ever taken a commercial ancestry test yourself, drop your result in the comments below. Alongside the HLA study and the Pangenome project, a separate line of research went even deeper still into the kind of DNA test result you may have already seen on a commercial ancestry kit. The markers passed down from just one parent at a time, father to son, mother to daughter, generation after generation, largely unchanged. On the paternal father-to-son line, studies across the Arabian Peninsula find one marker, J1, at strikingly high frequency, an estimated 40 to 70% of men sampled in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Move north and east toward the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian Plateau, and a related but different marker, J2, takes over instead, sitting at roughly 20 to 30% across that corridor. Two different father line signatures. On two sides of the exact same regional divide, the HLA clusters had already pointed to independently. The mother-to-daughter line tells a related but separate story. One maternal marker, U7, shows up more often in Iranian populations than in Arab populations to the west and south, a contrast that lines up neatly with the same broader east-west divide. A step-linked marker from the far north, R1A, follows a similar pattern historically. It arrived on the Iranian plateau roughly 2000 to 1500 BCE, carried in by migrations from the steppe, and it remains more common there today than among Arab populations to the south, even though it shows up on both sides. It's worth naming plainly why researchers look at both lines separately in the first place. The paternal Y chromosome and the maternal mitochondrial DNA travel down two completely separate family lines, father to son and mother to daughter, respectively, and they can carry different histories entirely, especially in regions with a long history of migration where men and women sometimes arrived from different places at different times for different reasons. Reading both lines side by side gives researchers a much richer picture than either one alone, which is exactly why the direction of the two markers here lining up with the same broader east-west divide is a stronger signal than either one would be by itself. None of these four separate lines of evidence, the HLA clusters, the ancient DNA divergence dates, the pangenome gap, or the paternal and maternal lineage markers, were looking for the same thing when the research began. They were run by different teams using different laboratory methods on completely different research timelines, years apart from each other. And yet, all four independently point to the exact same underlying reality. The identity called Arab was built directly on top of at least four genetically distinct, much older populations that never fully merged into one. That kind of independent convergence is exactly what makes a finding like this hard to dismiss. A single study can be a fluke, a sampling quirk, or a statistical artifact. Four separate studies using four separate methods on four separate timelines, all landing on the same east to west, peninsula to periphery divide is a much harder pattern to explain away as coincidence. So what does the word Arab describe? Once you strip away 14 centuries of assumption, not a bloodline, a shared language that spread through conquest, a shared faith that spread through conversion, a shared culture built and continuously rebuilt over 14 centuries through trade, migration, and empire. Underneath that shared identity sit at least 4 populations old enough to predate the word Arab by thousands of years. The Berber-descended populations of North Africa, the peninsula population sitting closest to the historical origin of the word itself, and the Levant and Mesopotamian populations descended from Canaanite, Assyrian, Phoenician, and Aramean roots that stretch back to the beginning of recorded history. Same language today, same faith today, 4 different beginnings underneath. That does not make the identity any less real for the 357 million people who hold it today, and it is not a claim that erases or diminishes anyone's history. It means the identity was built the way most large, lasting identities get built in the real world, not from one bloodline, spreading outward from a single point, but from several much older populations choosing, or in some cases being pulled, into something shared over a very long period of time. If you trace your own family history back far enough, one of these 4 populations is very likely where your own personal story starts. And this pattern is not unique to the Arab world either. Nearly every large national or cultural identity on Earth, once geneticists look underneath it, turns out to be built the same way. A shared language or faith spreading across populations that were already genetically distinct long before that identity existed. The Arab world is simply one of the largest, most recent, and most thoroughly documented examples of a pattern that keeps showing up everywhere researchers have looked closely enough to check. None of this is a story about Arabs specifically, in other words. It is a story about how identity works everywhere, once you are willing to look past the label on a census form and into what 4 independent, unrelated genetic studies run years apart by different research teams found sitting underneath it the whole time. So which of the 4 clusters do you think your own family history traces back to? Drop it in the comments below. Plenty of viewers on this channel have been surprised by the answer once they looked into their own background. And if this is the kind of history nobody ever taught you in school, subscribe. This channel exists to keep finding the real stories the textbook version consistently leaves out.